In 1902, inside a set of offices in New York City, a small circle of men agreed to spend more money on American schooling than the federal government was spending on it at the time. Not one of them was a teacher. None of them had ever graded a paper or stood in front of a room full of restless children. Two names hang over that whole era, Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, and both of them sat on fortunes so large they rivaled the treasuries of entire nations. Over the next 3 decades, the institutions their money built would reach into almost every history textbook printed in this country. The official version of what happened is simple and even flattering. These were industrial giants late in their lives, looking to give something back, choosing to pour their wealth into libraries, universities, and the education of ordinary people. Generosity on a scale the world had never seen before. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. But there is a second version of this story. It has moved quietly through forums and video channels for years now, passed between people who feel that something about the accepted history does not sit right, and it turns on a single, uncomfortable question. If you control the money behind the textbooks, do you eventually, in ways that are hard to prove and even harder to undo, come to control the past itself? That is the question we are going to live inside for the next half hour. Not to hand you a tidy conclusion, but to walk the timeline slowly, to separate what is documented from what is only claimed, and to see how much of the strange version actually survives once you hold it up against the record. To understand how any of this became possible, you have to picture what American education looked like before the turn of the century. And the first thing to understand is that it was not really a system at all. It was a patchwork. In the decades after the Civil War, schooling in the United States was a local affair. A town ran its own school. A county picked its own books. What a child learned in rural Ohio could look very different from what a child learned in Boston or in the hills of Tennessee. The most common books in the country were the McGuffey readers, filled with moral lessons and short passages, and beyond those, history was taught out of dozens of competing volumes written by dozens of competing authors, each with their own emphasis, their own heroes, their own version of events. And here is a detail that matters more than it first appears. In the South, in the years after the war, a movement rose up to make absolutely certain that Southern children learned the war a particular way. Groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy actively vetted textbooks, campaigned against the ones they disliked, and pushed a softened story of the Confederacy into classroom after classroom. This is not a fringe claim. It is documented history. And it tells you something important before we go any further. The fight over who controls the textbook is not a modern invention, and it is not a paranoid fantasy. It is one of the oldest fights in this country, and by 1900 it was already fierce. To a modern eye, that patchwork of local books sounds like chaos. To the people funding what came next, it looked like something worse. It looked like inefficiency. Because the country was changing fast, the factories were multiplying. The railroads were stitching the continent together. And the men who owned those factories and railroads had a very particular problem. They needed workers. Not just any workers, but reliable ones. People who would show up when the whistle blew, follow instructions without argument, and slot cleanly into a machine that ran on order and repetition. A patchwork of local schools, each teaching its own values, was never going to produce that kind of workforce at scale. Around this same time, American educators had been traveling to Prussia and coming home impressed. The Prussian model of schooling was orderly, uniform, and centralized. Bells, grades, fixed subjects, students moving through the day on a schedule. It was, in many ways, built to produce obedient citizens and capable soldiers. Reformers like Horace Mann had already been importing pieces of that idea decades earlier, and by the end of the century, the appetite for standardization was everywhere you looked. In 1892, a group known as the Committee of 10 sat down to bring order to the curriculum. Led by the president of Harvard, They laid out recommendations for what every high school in the country should teach, and for how long. This is the moment where the loose, local, sprawling world of American schooling first started to harden into a single national shape, and history, as a subject, was part of what they were shaping. Decades later, a New York City schoolteacher named John Taylor Gatto, a man who had actually won awards for his teaching, would look back at this exact period and argue something that still makes people uncomfortable. He claimed that mass compulsory schooling in America was never really designed to create free thinkers, curious readers, or independent minds. It was designed, he said, to create manageable ones, punctual, orderly, accustomed to sitting still and waiting for instructions from an authority at the front of the room. Whether or not you accept his darkest conclusions, Gatto was pointing at something concrete. The people who paid to build the modern school did have a vision of the kind of citizen it should produce, and they said so openly in essays and reports that anyone can still read. The design of the classroom was not an accident. It was a choice, made by specific people, for specific reasons. Now hold that picture in your mind. A country that is standardizing its schools, an industrial class that wants a standardized workforce, and a curriculum that is being pulled, for the first time, toward a single national mold. Into that exact moment walks the money. Andrew Carnegie had built his fortune in steel. By the time he sold his company in 1901, he walked away with an amount of money that is difficult to even describe in modern terms. He had already written an essay called The Gospel of Wealth, in which he argued that the rich had a duty to give their fortunes away during their own lifetimes, and that they, the wealthy, were better suited than anyone else to decide how that money should be used to improve society. Read that idea again slowly. The argument was not simply that the rich should give, it was that the rich should decide. John D. Rockefeller had built an even larger fortune in oil, and he thought along very similar lines. In 1902, Rockefeller founded the General Education Board. On paper, its mission was the promotion of education within the United States, without distinction of race, sex, or creed. It was chartered by an act of Congress the following year, and it became one of the most influential forces in the history of American schooling that most Americans have never even heard of. A few years later, in 1905, Carnegie created the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. And here we reach one of those small, dry, bureaucratic details that turns out to matter enormously. That foundation helped create a standard measurement for how much learning counted as a single unit of education. We still use it today. We call it the Carnegie unit. The very way we slice up a student's time, the credit hour, the idea that sitting in a certain subject for a certain number of hours equals a certain fixed amount of learning, traces back to a foundation built on steel money. There was another lever too, and it is the one people walk past every day without a second thought. Carnegie did not only fund schools, he funded libraries, and not a few of them. Across the United States, he paid for the construction of roughly 2,500 public libraries, grand stone buildings that still anchor the main streets of towns from coast to coast. The official story, again, is generosity, and much of it genuinely was. But a library is also a place that decides which books sit on its shelves and which never arrive at all, and the theorists are quick to point out that the man who paid for the building was a man with very strong opinions about what a public ought to read. Whether you find that sinister or simply practical, the underlying pattern is now impossible to miss. The same fortune reached into the schools, the teacher colleges, the curriculum commissions, and the very buildings where the public went to learn on its own. Steel money was quietly everywhere that knowledge was kept. This is the part of the story that is not conspiracy. This is documented history, sitting in plain sight. Private fortunes, built in oil and in steel, reached directly into the structure of American education and left fingerprints that are still pressed into the system a full century later. But how does money actually change what a child reads in a history book? It is worth slowing down here, because the mechanism is more interesting and far more subtle than most people expect. A foundation does not pass laws. It cannot force a single school district to adopt a single sentence. What it can do is fund, and funding, applied carefully and patiently over decades, is its own kind of quiet power. Start with the teachers. If you want to shape what is taught to millions, you do not chase the millions of students. You shape the far smaller number of people who train the teachers. In the early 20th century, foundation money flowed heavily into the institutions that produced educators, and one of the most influential of these was Teachers College at Columbia University in New York. The people trained there fanned out across the country, carrying a shared philosophy of education with them into classrooms, onto school boards, and into state departments of education. Shape the source, and you shape the river. And the philosophy flowing down that river had a name and a face. Teachers College in this era became the home of progressive education, closely tied to the philosopher John Dewey, whose ideas about how children should be taught spread outward through the graduates of that single institution until they touched schools in nearly every state. Dewey himself was a serious and sincere thinker, and much of what he argued for was humane. But notice the structure of what had quietly formed. A handful of foundations funded a handful of colleges. Those colleges shaped the teachers, and the teachers shaped the children, all of it radiating outward from a few square blocks of Manhattan. Never in the history of the country had so much of what a nation believed about itself been decided in so small a room by so few people. Then there is accreditation and adoption. As schooling standardized, states and districts moved toward approved lists of textbooks. A publisher who wanted to survive needed to write books that fit the emerging national standard. And that emerging national standard was being shaped, in part, by the committees, studies, and reports that foundation money helped to fund. You did not need to dictate a single word to any author. You needed only to shape the environment in which the successful authors competed. The market quietly did the rest. And the market itself was narrowing. As the century turned, the sprawling world of small regional publishers began to consolidate into a handful of large houses capable of serving a national market. Fewer publishers meant fewer gatekeepers, and fewer gatekeepers meant that a single approved approach could spread across the whole country far faster than it ever could have in the days of the local printer. Standardization was not only happening in the schools, it was happening in the industry that fed them, and the two trends pushed on each other, tightening the funnel through which a nation's history had to pass before it reached a child's desk. And then there was direct funding of the histories themselves. In the 1920s and into the 1930s, the Carnegie and Rockefeller philanthropies underwrote enormous scholarly projects. One of the most cited, by critics of nearly every political persuasion, is the American Historical Association's Commission on the Social Studies, funded largely by Carnegie money, which produced a sweeping multi-volume report on how history and civics ought to be taught in American schools. Supporters saw a serious, thoughtful attempt to modernize education for a new century. Critics saw something colder. They saw the people who effectively owned the country deciding how the country's children would come to understand it. Very clear, there is a quote that circulates constantly in this corner of history, attributed to Frederick Gates, who ran Rockefeller's General Education Board. Writing about a vision for rural schooling, he described a dream in which the people yield themselves with perfect docility to a moulding hand, in which the old educational traditions fade quietly away, and reformers get to work their own will upon a grateful and responsive folk. Defenders will tell you, and they are not wrong, that Gates was a product of his time, and that his language was more starry-eyed than sinister. But strip away the intent and look only at the words on the page, and you can understand why they have haunted this subject for 100 years. The vision was one of shaping people, and the hand doing the shaping belonged to the richest men then alive. So that is the documented spine of the story. Now we come to the fork in the road. Because there is a community of researchers, and I use that word loosely, who take everything you have just heard and push it somewhere the mainstream will never follow. This is where the topic touches what many online now call Tartaria. For those who have never fallen down this particular rabbit hole, here is the shape of it. Proponents of these ideas argue that the history we were handed is not merely biased or incomplete, but fundamentally false. They claim that a far older, far more advanced civilization once spanned much of the globe, that its architecture and its knowledge dwarfed our own, and that at some point in the 18th or 19th century, this entire world was erased. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now. because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Erased first by catastrophe, they say, and then erased again by something far quieter, by the pen, by the printing press, by the careful rewriting of the textbooks. And this is exactly where the year 1902 stops being a footnote about school funding and becomes, for these researchers, the smoking gun. Because if you wanted to erase a civilization from human memory, you would not need to burn its buildings. Many of them, they argue, are still standing right in front of us. You would only need to change the story of who built them, and how, and when. And to change that story across an entire nation, you would need exactly the things that appeared, all at once, at the turn of the century. Enormous private wealth, a rapidly standardizing school system, and influence over the books. The proponents point to specific things, and it is worth hearing them out honestly before we weigh any of it. They point to the great expositions and world's fairs of the late 19th century, and especially to the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the so-called White City. It was a sprawling landscape of enormous neoclassical palaces, covered in domes and columns and statuary, gleaming white and lit by electric light. The official history says these were temporary structures, thrown up quickly out of a plaster-like material, and then torn down within a couple of years. The theorists ask how a nation with the tools of the 1890s could raise an entire gleaming metropolis of monumental buildings in barely 2 years, only to demolish the whole thing. They ask why so much of the grand architecture of that era, the courthouses, the cathedrals, the train stations, the exhibition halls, seems, to their eye, to sit beyond what the labour and the tools of the time should have been able to produce. They point to the star forts, those beautiful geometric fortifications shaped like many pointed stars, scattered across the globe in a strangely consistent pattern, and they ask why a single design appears on nearly every continent. They point to older books and older maps that, they claim, show details later editions quietly dropped. They point to photographs of muddy streets and half-buried ground-floor windows, and argue for a great flood of mud that once swallowed the lower stories of older cities. They point to the orphan trains, the very real program that relocated tens of thousands of children across the country, and they ask whether that was the resettlement of the genuinely orphaned, or the quiet repopulation of a land after a reset that had wiped out the adults who remembered what came before. Now, I want to be honest with you here, because this genre very often is not. Almost none of that grand version holds up under sober examination, and you deserve to know why. The White City was indeed built fast, but it was built fast precisely because it was built cheap, out of a temporary material called staff, a mix of plaster and fibre, chosen deliberately so the buildings could be monumental in appearance and disposable in reality. The muddy streets are simply what unpaved streets looked like in the age before asphalt. The lowered windows and buried lower floors usually reflect changes in the street grade over time. Roads raised for drainage, for sewers, and for utilities, a mundane and thoroughly documented process that any city engineer can explain. The star forts are not mysterious at all once you know the history. They are bastion forts, a style of military engineering developed in Europe as an answer to the cannon, their angled points designed so that no attacker could approach a wall without being caught in overlapping fields of fire. They appear all over the world for the simple reason that European empires carried the design all over the world. And the orphan trains, heartbreaking as they are among the best documented social programs of the era, with names, with families, with photographs, with paper trails you can still read today. And the largest claim, the idea of a single global empire erased within living memory, runs headlong into the simplest problem of all. Memory survives, letters survive. Diaries and newspapers and shipping records and church registers from those decades survive in overwhelming, crushing quantity, and they describe an ordinary human world of harvests and elections and gossip and grief. To erase a civilization, you would have had to erase all of that too, and no amount of foundation money could reach into every attic and every archive in every country on Earth. So why does the theory refuse to die? Why does it keep pulling in new people every single year? I think it is because it is wrapped tightly around a splinter of something true, and that splinter is the part of this story that is documented, the part we spent the first half of this video walking through together. The uncomfortable, verifiable fact is that a very small number of very wealthy men did reach directly into the machinery of American education at the exact moment it was being standardized. They did fund the teacher colleges. They did fund the commissions that shaped how history itself was taught. They did believe, in their own written words, that they were the right hands to mould a docile and grateful public. That is not Tartaria. That is the historical record, sitting quietly in the archives with its footnotes intact. And once you know that the powerful genuinely did shape the story, it becomes very easy, almost natural, to wonder what else they shaped. The theory takes a real seed of institutional control and grows it into a fantasy of total control. It takes documented influence over a curriculum and inflates it into the erasure of an entire lost world. The leap is enormous, but the runway it takes off from is real and solid, and that is exactly why it feels so convincing to so many people who are not foolish at all. There is a deeper truth hiding underneath all of this, and it does not require a lost empire to be genuinely unsettling. History is written by people. Those people are funded by other people. And the ones with the money have always had an outsized say in which stories get told, which get emphasized, which get softened, and which quietly fall out of the very next edition. You do not need a secret catastrophe to explain why textbooks change over time. You only need to know who paid for them, and what those people wanted the young to believe. Think about a single figure for a moment. The 1893 fair in Chicago was called the World's Columbian Exposition because it was staged to celebrate 400 years since Columbus reached the Americas, and in the textbooks of that time Columbus stood as a pure and unquestioned hero, a symbol of courage and discovery. Open a textbook printed a century later and you will find a very different man on the page, his voyages reframed, his cruelties named, his legacy argued over. The documents from 1492 did not change. The ships did not change. What changed was who held the pen and what the culture around that pen was willing to fund and to print. One figure, two completely different histories, and not a drop of mud or catastrophe required to explain the gap. Just time and money and the slow turning of who gets to decide. Consider how much the standard American history textbook has changed just within living memory, without any conspiracy required at all. Figures who were once celebrated without a single caveat are now questioned and complicated. Events that were once left out entirely are now placed at the center of the story. Whole chapters have been rewritten, not because the past itself changed, but because the present changed, and because different people with different values and different funding gained a say in the telling. The past is not a fixed object that we simply retrieve from a shelf. It is a story that each generation assembles, and every generation assembles it a little differently, using the materials and the money available to them at the time. The men of 1902 understood this better than almost anyone who had ever lived. Carnegie wrote openly that the wealthy should administer the fruits of civilization on behalf of the community as a kind of trustee for everyone beneath them. Rockefeller's board set out, deliberately and in writing, to shape a nation's schooling from the top down. They were not hiding a drowned civilization beneath the mud. What they were actually doing was, in a sense, more ordinary and far more lasting. They were deciding, with the leverage that only staggering wealth can provide, what an entire country's children would grow up believing was important and, just as crucially, what they would never once think to question. So, where does all of that finally leave us? Not with a drowned empire buried under the mud, not with secret suppressed editions of textbooks that describe a vanished golden world. The dramatic version collapses the very moment you press your thumb against it. But the quieter version, the one that says the past is downstream of money, that the people who fund the schools help shape the memory of an entire nation, that a mere handful of private fortunes left a permanent fingerprint on how tens of millions of people understand their own country and their own origins, that version does not collapse. It sits there in the archives, in the charters, in the annual foundation reports, patient and documented and, ironically, almost entirely unread. Maybe that is the real reason a story like Tartaria spreads the way it does. It is not that people are stupid or gullible. It is that they can sense the fingerprint. They can feel, somewhere underneath the polished official story, that the history they were handed in a classroom was shaped by hands they were never shown, and so they reach for the biggest, most dramatic explanation available, because no one ever taught them the smaller and truer one. They were never told, while they sat in that classroom, who had paid for the classroom. Which brings us all the way back around to the question we started with. If you control the money behind the textbooks, do you control the past? And the honest answer is that it is not a clean yes, and it is not a clean no. You do not get to erase a civilization. The evidence for that simply is not there, and it never was. But you do get to choose the frame. You get to decide which questions feel natural to ask, and which ones simply never come up. You get to fund the version of the story that flatters you, and quietly starve the version that does not. And if you do that carefully enough, across enough decades, across enough classrooms, you may never need to erase a single thing at all. The stories you left out will simply never be missed, because no one will ever remember that they were once there to begin with. None of this asks you to believe in a lost golden empire. It asks you to believe something smaller and far harder to dismiss, that the memory of a nation is a thing that can be curated, and that the people with the deepest pockets have always understood this more clearly than the people sitting in the classroom. That is the quiet lesson buried under the loud one. The loud lesson promises a drowned civilization. The quiet lesson simply asks you to notice who signs the checks. And of the two, it is the quiet one that should keep you up at night, because it is the one you can actually verify. The buildings from that era are still standing. The foundations those men created are still operating, still funding, still shaping, still writing checks with strings attached that stretch on for generations. And the textbooks are still being rewritten, edition after edition after edition, by people whose names most students will never learn, paid for by institutions most students will never think to question. The past, it turns out, was never quite as settled as it looked on the page. And the most interesting history of all may not be the one printed inside the book. It may be the hidden history of who decided what the book would say, and who decided what it would leave out. Those men understood something that most people never stop to consider. You do not win the argument over history by shouting the loudest inside it. You win it much earlier, and much more quietly, by being the one who pays for the paper it is printed on, the one who funds the college that trains the teacher, and the one who is patient enough to let a single chosen version of the story harden slowly into the only version anyone can still remember was ever told in the first place, and then set free.